Hey there. So this session is going to be focused on the term liberation, which, as I said in the last one, we're going somewhere, right? This is going to be different. We're going to go on a different journey. Um, so I know this is a term that has a lot of, we'll just say, a lot of energy behind it. It's kind of a powerful term, right? It doesn't have a lot of energy in terms of it's being used widely right now, but it has a lot of energy as a word. It's something that's kind of powerful, and probably makes some people feel a little uncomfortable. So here we go. Ready? So here we are still in the map, and we're still very much in that top section, just like the last session. So we're still talking about these issues of thriving, right? And in the last session, just very briefly went through the concepts of inclusion, equity, and social justice. So, sort of starting from where we left off, where do you think inclusion, equity, and social justice, in the context of today's system of capitalism, competition, and greed, and exploitation, where do those inclusion, equity, and social justice, where do they ultimately bring us if we're in that context? So, in other words, to what end? So, why inclusion? Why equity? Social justice? Why them? Like, what are we trying to accomplish by doing those? And again, I know that they're very well intended, right? Um, but are we thinking this through totally? So, one of the ways that we might be missing the point is, are we trying to take folks who are exploited and give them the opportunity to become an exploiter? And of course, no, right? That's not what we're intending for. But if we're not really talking about the result that we're aiming for, what it is that we're envisioning, then we have to, by default, use the current system that we're living in. And the current system is one that is very oriented towards making money, competition, um, whether or not you want to be, you have to be part of exploitation. So being successful, right? Having everybody having the opportunity to be successful in this context means having to participate in a lot of practices that create exclusion, create inequity, create social injustice. So, can we truly have social justice, for instance, if we need to participate in a system that requires social injustice? Okay? So, is this what we mean, for instance? Right? There's inclusion there. There seemingly was equity on the way to there. And now we have social justice because it's a person of color who is, at least, the way that this picture depicts it, experiencing high levels of concentrated wealth. Is that what we're aiming for? Right? So one would hope at this particular moment you're sort of running straight into a wall of tension. Right? I mean, this is not, this is sort of like oh my God, is that what we mean when we're talking about this? Because in our society, we spend a lot of time making heroes out of billionaires. I mean, we're critiquing them now, right? We're being very critical of them because we are finally seeing the damage that greed does in our society. But you know, Bill Gates, hero. Steve Jobs, hero, right? The list goes on. But the way in which that we keep characterizing success, characterizing opportunity, right? Characterizing social justice is within the system itself. Okay? So we have to work this out. So, can someone be against greed and exploitation in all kinds and avoid participating in egocentrism, displays of hyperconsumerism, environmental abuse, sexism, racism, classism, and still become wealthy in our society? Is that possible? And maybe possible is not the right word. Maybe probable is the better word, right? Because the inclinations, the current, is all pointing towards greed, exploitation, and participating in those things on some level, right? So that becomes the problem. If you are sort of thinking about your kids and you're thinking about their success in life later on, um, are we either painting a picture in front of them that looks kind of like this, or maybe somebody who works for this guy is a level of success that we're uh, sort of envisioning for our kids, um, right? Is that where we're at? Okay. So liberation from what exactly, right? Is it that radical of a term? Is it something that we should be uncomfortable with? Is it something that we should be scared of? So here's this painting by Jessica Pearlstein, and I mentioned this in the very first video, the introduction video. Um, let's go through this a bit more in detail. So right up front there, you see a woman of color, right? She's on the rooftop, and this is San Francisco, the town of or city of San Francisco, and the artist's mind has been retrofitted, right? It's not been torn down; it's been retrofitted. So it's really a replacement. The question is it a replacement of a system, or is it just tweaking of a system, right? So we have to ask ourselves that question here. Now, is everything contingent upon replacing the entire system? Well, let's get into this a bit more, right? There's a lot of things that we can infer from this painting. Um, so let's start with some of those inferences, right? One of the main inferences is environmentally and technologically, we're a lot more in balance. And this is a city, so a lot more energy use in a concentrated way for sure. But seemingly, the artist has made every attempt possible to retrofit the space with more responsible energy production, right? So we see the solar panels, we see the wind turbines, and we were just getting this at least idea, because it is a painting, right, or a drawing. It needs to it can't sort of do everything for us, but it's giving us a vision, and so in that vision, it seems like that part of it is pretty well in balance. And these are technologies we have right now. The other thing is that the city has become much more of a green space than it was. Rooftops, along the streets, you see a lot more plant life in this space, which also means a lot more carbon capturing, which is a good thing, right? Global warming, the main problem with that is the composition of our atmosphere turning into more of a blanket than we want it to be, need it to be, or can survive in a balanced way with. Anyway, we see a lot more rooftop gardening too. Um, whether it's the geodesic domes or the greenhouse, you see plants in the vertical spaces, you see plants on top and all that. So there's a lot going on here. Now, you also see in the street, right? She's indicating there with her drawing, sort of the spiral garden there and all that, at least elements of permaculture, which is a whole area of sort of plant management. I don't know. But it's a way of thinking about plants and organizing them that becomes much more that they're working with each other rather than plant something, grow something, get the tomatoes, pull them out, kind of thing. So there's more of the sort of orchards. There's more of the plants that stick around, right? They're more perennials and all that. Anyway, the point here is that we're really retrofitting this space, but are we replacing? Well, in one indication here, we've entirely replaced the roads. These are not roads anymore, right? These are just large spaces for gardens. And in the intersection there, you see all those little colorful dots, and that's meant to represent people who are meeting an intersection. So intersections are now replaced, in terms of their purpose, they're replaced in more democratic spaces, right? So that's a replacement. We haven't replaced the buildings, but there's not really a need to replace buildings. In fact, that would be a huge, not just costly endeavor, but it would also take a big hit on the environment to take everything down and then find the resources again to build it back up. So there's a bit more of a responsible use by just retrofitting. And we see prayer flags, right? The rainbow colored flags stretching from one side to the right side, right? So the left side of the street to the right side of the street. Those are Buddhist prayer flags. So when you start to combine some elements here, right? The Buddhist prayer flags with a woman of color who seemingly is pretty happy or content, at least in this moment. And you see her appreciating the blossom. So there's seemingly a support for social diversity here, right? There's a woman who seems pretty content. She's a woman of color. You have the Buddhist prayer flags. And all of these things are sort of interwoven with each other. They're not separate, right? There's a real attempt to make the social and ecological much more interwoven. And we also see how the individual well-being is interwoven. That interwovenness is, in my mind, a replacement of the isolated individualism. So I can get behind that and say that that's a replacement, right? So there's a replacement of the physical space on some level. There's a replacement of the way the space is used. There's a replacement of thinking here that has to do with the way things are connected, right? This is an integrative way of thinking, and it is manifested in the repurposing of space, and seemingly there's again inferred, but seemingly there's a positive impact on the individual well-being with this too. You following me here? So liberation from what exactly? Well, this is not like we have to jump from our planet to another planet. We're not replacing the planet, right? It doesn't have to be that grand, is what I'm saying here. What it can be, though, is liberating from ways of thinking. So, liberation from what? Well, liberation from liberation from egocentrism, right? So this liberation is anti-egocentrism. This liberation is anti-hyperconsumerism, anti-exploitation, anti-anthropocentrism, anti-racism. Let me pause there for a second, right? Right now we're having this discussion in general, sort of more broadly, about being an anti-racist. So the difference there is, instead of being sort of multicultural inclusionist, to be an anti-racist is a difference between really just including folks to speaking out very specifically and explicitly against racism, because they're not the same thing. Including somebody is a very, it's a good thing to do, but speaking out against racism is the position of anti-racism. So I'm extending that here. What would anti-egocentrism be? Again, it's not just whatever the parallel might be to inclusion at the level of race or class or gender, this would be an explicit, specific effort against a hyper, especially, egocentrism. So we would actually be explicitly really talking about that. And ask yourself, do we have that conversation? Do we look at egocentrism within ourselves? Do we, as teachers, talk about it with our kids? As parents, talk about it with our kids? As adults, talk about it with each other? Because it's one thing to sort of harbor dislike for egocentrism, but it's another thing to actually really speak out against it. Because once you start to speak out against it, you're going to see how egocentrism is a main part of how we run our lives, run our societies, right? Same thing for hyperconsumerism. Are we actually speaking out against it, or are we letting it slide, right? By not speaking out against it. Maybe we're not participating in it, right, or trying not to, but are we really speaking out against it? And I don't think the answer is no. But when we do, that's just like anti-racism is actually speaking against and teaching against racism. All of these antis are doing the same thing with those categories. So anti-sexism, right? Continuing that vein. So the next one there is critical examination of humans as an invasive species. Well, we talk about a lot of invasive species, and if you put a boat in a pond, right, you're supposed to wash off the bottom so you don't carry those invasive species to another, aquatic environment. So we talk about invasive species in those ways, but are we talking about ourselves as an invasive species? Which means that we're a species that puts all other species that we come in contact with, or most other, out of balance, right? Are we messing with the ecosystems? And if so, which we are we critically examining ourselves as a species? And then you see the rest there: anti-violence, anti-war, anti-extremism, anti-fundamentalism, and then underlying philosophies of oppression, right? Are we engaged in looking at those things? Now, why would that be liberation when you look at those collectively? Is because our current systems rely on us to engage in the sort of pro versions of those things, right? They rely on us to engage in exploitation, sexism, racism, oppression, so forth, right? We are at these extreme levels right now, and we're seeing the failures of that for sure. But moreover, we've been hurting people and hurting the planet for a very long time. Getting out of that pattern in and of itself would be liberation. Participating in it, being successful in it, would not be liberation. See the difference? So being freed from, right? So when we look at inclusion, equity, and social justice, as they're talked about now, they're not really aimed at moving away from the system. They're about changes within the system. They're talked about oftentimes in that kind of context. Whereas folks who are talking about liberation, and there are many, are not saying, let me put it this way, they're not saying, give me inclusion, equity, and social justice. They're not saying that. They're saying, give me liberation. Meaning, complete separation from the system in the way that it's constructed right now. We need another system that's, built strongly and rigorously and comprehensively enough to replace what's going on now. Because this one is very comprehensive in the way that it, uses exploitation, for instance, right? We can't just have an exploitive system and then say, let's be anti-exploitive and somehow keep the same system and just tweak it, right? Now that for a lot of people is really uncomfortable because it seems like it's so much, it seems like it's overwhelming, it seems like it's overly radical. Now the word radical just simply means changing from one system to the other. That's its actual definition, but we stigmatize it and demonize that kind of thinking, mostly because we're probably too afraid to really think about change along these lines. But that's what liberation is about. Liberation is about changing the systems and the institutions and the practices. And in this case, those systems, institutions, and practices of exploitation, right? And completely retrofitting the space or even really replacing the way in which we think and practice, right? And you see there an ideology of question mark. That's a little foreshadowing, okay? So, right, this is just sort of blowing up the what you saw on the last slide there, okay? This is a liberation of our thinking. It's a liberation of practices. It's a liberation of, that's pretty inclusive, right? A lot of things. But it is a real reorganization based in our core thinking, okay? So, who is actually thriving in a way that does not rely on high levels of exploitation here, right? So if you look at the two pictures, after you know the previous discussion, it's pretty obvious what the intention is here, right? The if you are going to succeed in our system as it currently is, even with the tweaking that we talk about, what we're really talking about is having somebody who is often the target of exploitation becoming somebody who can successfully exploit, right? So what are the internal and external conditions, right? In other words, what is the individual well-being and the external social, ecological sustainability? So the individual well-being on the left presumably has a lot of problems. As we know, greed, power, wealth create a lot of well-being issues, right? And it's generated from the space of greed. I mean, greed is sort of the primary driver here, but it manifests itself in lots of ways. On the right, you get a different sense, I think, of the individual well-being of that person on the rooftop. And then the external and social ecological sustainability is also sort of mirrored, right? Her individual well-being seems to be connected to and mirrored by the externals, right? If you go back to the left, right, the world as it is right now, through exploitation, greed, competition, is suffering. As I said before, somebody who engages in wealth, power, competition, all that, right now we're so sort of blind by wealth and the ideology, right, our ideas of wealth, that we oftentimes think of it so positively, right? But the reality is that most people who are wealthy are at this level of wealth are really engaging in very negative things, and whether they're even self-aware is a question. But there is not a high level of individual well-being going on there. There's not a high quality there. So which of these are we currently collectively teaching towards in mainstream public education? It's a really important question at this point, isn't it? Because if we're going to teach towards thriving, if we're currently engaged in, whether it's explicitly or implicitly, teaching towards the picture on the left versus the picture on the right, right? We are not being very mindful of what we're doing as teachers, right? If all we're thinking of is this sort of myopic view of, I would like to see my kids do well in school so they could, do well in our society, well, our society as a whole is doing a lot of negative things, so to be successful in it also means to do a lot of negative things. Are we thinking this through, right? Whereas on the right, if a society is much more balanced, cooperative, caring, integratively seen and connected in that way, and we work with that in our minds and in our practices, if that's what's going on, and that's what we're teaching towards, okay then, right? That's a big difference. So you sort of see that reflected here, right? Right now, the argument is that inclusion, equity, and social justice, unless we're talking about it explicitly, are by default connected to egocentrism and exploitation, ultimately, because egocentrism and exploitation are the forms of success in our society. Whereas, if we use a more thriving context, collective, community thriving, then inclusion, equity, and social justice towards that kind of thriving is probably what we're actually, in our minds, really want to aim for. But if we're not questioning what the larger system is that we're applying it to, then we're by default participating in something that we're not intending for it to be that way. Whereas if we're talking about thriving, and we're explicitly talking about it in that way, and that's what we're really intending for, which I think we're intending for, underneath it all. I think we actually are intending for that. But not recognizing what the larger system is and produces and how it acts and what it reproduces, that I think is where we stall out. And then we end up inadvertently, right, doing something negative because we haven't had that discussion yet. So, here's the prompts. Number 1, to what extent do you think that greed is connected to the way in which we think about other words like success, freedom, and American dream? Number 2, how might mainstream public education reinforce a greed mindset based on the last question? Right? And then number 3, review your answers from the prompts from the last session. Okay, so go back to the last session. And this is why I always encourage you to have those electronic files shared. And when you go through the activity of recording some of those ideas sort of collectively, this is why. So we're going to do some critical reflection here. So review your answers from the prompts from the last session. What changes occur in our own thinking when inclusion, equity, and justice are reconsidered with liberation from greed and exploitation? Okay, so go back and look at what you wrote as a group, what some of the thoughts were, maybe some of the patterns that came up, the way in which you were contextualizing and characterizing inclusion, equity, and justice. And now that we're sort of considering this notion of liberation from greed and exploitation, and having a larger context of thriving as the context for really thinking about inclusion, equity, and justice. What happens in your own thinking with that? And have that conversation. Okay? So the activity you can see there, the way in which you can create the folder of sharing and all this sort of fun thing, right? So the folder is still thriving planning. The subfolder is still issues of thriving. And then the file name 02 liberation. So there's your new document. And here we go again, right? In addition to brief discussions about your thoughts to the discussion prompts, what patterns came up among your colleagues during those discussions? Identify at least 3 of the most important patterns and record them in the electronic document that you can all access. Keep them organized by the discussion prompts. Okay, so same sort of thing that you did in the last session. There's going to be a lot of recording ideas right now. We're in a space where we're really talking about ideas and the way in which we think about things. So there's going to be a lot of sort of recording the ways that we think about things, and then going back through them through critical reflection. Okay. Number 2, in a whole group setting, basically whatever kind of group that you can form. I don't know, again, how many people you have in your group, but try to keep it large-ish and manageable. Discuss the tensions you might feel related to the topics from this session, and then record the answers. So I realize that I'm putting something out there that, as I said before, might make us feel a little bit uncomfortable, might make us feel like, whoa, this is really radical. Whoa, I'm not sure I'm there yet. Whoa, what's going on with this guy? He's so crazy. So anyway, you feel free to do whatever you want, but and maybe you're already like, yeah, man, you put words right to it. That's what I was thinking about. Awesome. Great. So that would not be very many tensions if you're the latter. But have that discussion and really talk about some of the things that you are feeling in terms of, what do we do with this? I don't know how I feel about this. What is he talking about? Does this mean that we have to consider the whole system and redo the whole system? That's overwhelming, right? So there's some tensions there. Okay? So just where are you at right now with this conversation? And that, my friends, is that. I'll see you in the next session. Take care.